Welcome to the Unmuted Podcast. My name is Jeff. I'm the host of the podcast, and we talk about all things HR tech, leadership, world of work, AI, of course, and anything that connects to our work. And so all of our episodes live on our website, ScaleHR.com, also on YouTube. We will be launching our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts soon. So that's coming. So this is a fantastic topic here, and it's called From Listening to Recognition, How AI Will Shape Engagement in 2026. So that's the topic, and it's a pretty good one. I think, obviously AI is a huge topic right now. It was in 2025. It will continue to be in 2026. And so before I bring in our guest, Catalano, who is a longtime contact and friend of mine, probably going back many years. But let me just make just a couple of points just to frame this topic first. And so I guess the first point that I want to make is employee engagement is actually evolving. So for years, employee listening and recognition have often been treated as a separate initiative. And so surveys on the one side, recognition programs on the other. But as we look ahead to 2026, I would argue that separation is gone. And it doesn't really make any sense. So engagement is becoming a continuous loop where listening, insight, and action are deeply connected. So that's the first point. And I think the second point is, why AI changes everything. So obviously, I can go on for hours about this, but I'm not going to. So what's really changing the game in AI? Not as a replacement for human judgment, but as an accelerator. And so I've talked about this many times. And so helping HR teams make sense of massive amounts of feedback, data, spot patterns earlier, personalize recognition, and close the gaps between what employees say and then what you as the organizations actually do. And so today we're going to explore what that shift really means in practice. And I really can't think of anybody better to talk about this topic is Rob Catalano of WorkTango. And so, Rob's been around the HR tech, employee engagement space for far too long, just like me. So, Rob, welcome to the Muted podcast.
Yes, Jeff, thanks for having me. And congrats on all the new stuff you've been doing over the last year and a half as the world of HR and work has shifted. So happy to be here and a long time no see. But to Jeff's point, we've known each other probably for 2 decades.
Yes, I was going to say 20 years, but I didn't want to say 20 years because that makes me look old, makes you look old. But you know what?
We're all together, buddy.
Anyway, yeah, exactly. And so we first met one another when you were at a company called I Love Rewards, which was then renamed, to Achievers. And you were probably like employee number, 4 or 5, I think, 8.
Yeah, early stage. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. But you know what? We're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about WorkTango, but more specifically about this topic. And so once again, the topic is From Listening to Recognition, How AI Will Shape Employee Engagement in 2026. And so maybe I think, most of the audience who tend to watch this podcast, probably knows of your name, but maybe you want to give us a bit of an overview of what you do.
Yeah. So glad to be here again. So I am one of the co-founders of WorkTango. I think your initial comment about Achievers is a good kind of starting point to the introduction. Actually, again, early stage on the founding team at Achievers, spent 11 years working in that organization from a recognition and reward perspective, not only building that company, but also working with customers day in and day out on recognition and reward strategies. Once that ended in over 10 years ago, I co-founded WorkTango, which was on the employee listening side. Think about employee surveys and listening and action throughout the whole employee lifecycle. And that's pretty much it. I think for the last 21 years, it's been helping organizations with these types of strategies. And it's funny, you're calling this episode kind of the shift, and there's been a shift, right? There's been a shift in both and how they've impacted each other. And it's actually really interesting, right? When I was back at Achievers with recognition, reward, technology, and supporting companies, there was always, I would love the engagement data to be able to understand the impact of what this was having on the business and the company. When I was just in the employee listening side, it's like, great, this stuff is working, this stuff isn't. How can I support that in terms of moving the needle on action or focusing on incentivizing or recognizing, rewarding the right behaviors. And now with both, it's like, okay, great. Now you're seeing those two worlds come together, supporting each other, and just living and breathing that every day with companies across the globe. So, yeah, that's kind of my intro, but I think I've been living a lot of what you want to talk about today, Jeff. So happy to, dig in and add any
Yeah,
context and any
absolutely.
support for the listeners.
That's a pretty good summary, because I think the technology has come a long way in the last maybe 20 years. When I first started my career years ago, I won't say the year, but back then you had to actually download software onto your servers, right? And it was very clunky software that, when you wanted to make a change, it took about 9 years, and then lots of money. And so now software is very flexible, obviously. And so I'm really like this shift didn't just happen overnight. So when we're really talking about employee engagement focused platform, this just didn't happen yesterday. And so I guess now we're in 2026. So when you look ahead to this year, how do you see employee listening and recognition evolving? And then what forces are driving that change?
Yeah, so I think forces driving change, which are probably relevant to all across the, let's call it the HR or workplace ecosystem. Obviously, there's people still, distributed workforces that are remote and so on. So how do you connect those teams? How do you make sure you understand their sentiment or their great work is being seen and recognized? A big trend is, HR is realizing now with less resources and more expectations that they have to enable their leaders. I don't think that's been untrue for the last couple of years. Or how do you enable your leaders to be able to drive what you're going to do with the insights you get through employee listening, or how do you build a culture of recognition? So I think that's a big part. And then I think the big one is just on the skills gap, right? There's so many companies transforming their business to try to activate folks to leverage new AI technology or change the way they go to market, given what's happening with this whole AI, blitz, let's call it, in our organizations. And obviously that impacts, how are people feeling about these skills gaps? Are they bridging the gap on it? Are you incentivizing people conducting those types of activities? So I think there's just all this transformation that's forcing change. I think the core idea, and back to your, I answered the question backwards, but in terms of what the evolution is, I think a big
Yeah.
one is, I think it's moving from programs to kind of ecosystems. Like no longer is it this one program you listen to employees once a year, or you reward people's 5 years of service because they stuck it out and they were breathing for that long, right? It's more about what's the strategy that supports the whole employee experience journey. And think about rewards. Like it's not transactional. Like you did something, get a gift card. It's like relational. Like let's see how you contributed to the values in the organization, how you helped support and contributed. And I think it's just more of this always on experience versus this, one-off program. And I think the other thing too, Jeff, the one thing I'll say is in terms of evolution, these used to be separate departments, right? Like
Yeah.
rewards was in total rewards and benefits. And then, employee experience had listening and a couple of other things. Then there was the L&D world. But unless there's a cohesive strategy across the whole employee experience, even beyond listening and rewards, I see a lot of companies consolidating that to make sure they're all speaking the same system. Maybe the last thing I'll say is because of all that, the data you're sitting on, now there's huge opportunity from an AI lens, to your point, to leverage that. But, holistically, a lot of shifts that are impacting how this industry is changing. But it is starting to merge and meld together in fun ways, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember when I was in HR, practicing HR, I was leading HR, and it was always trying to move past that programmatic mindset. Like, it's a survey time, and it's like this whole thing. And I was like, well, this doesn't work, right? But now, obviously, I think your point earlier when you said always on, I think that's the key point. That's what we've been striving towards, right? Because people aren't on one day and then off the next day. They're always on, right? So things always happen. So you talked about data, and I think that sort of segues into my next question, which is about one of the biggest challenges right now that HR has is turning listening data into meaningful action. So that's always been a challenge, taking data, analyze it, but then act on it. And so how does AI, and this is where we get into the fun, well, AI is fun, but how does AI help close that gap without overwhelming teams?
Yeah, so I think we've been talking a lot about AI, and it gets this overwhelming response in terms of negativity and how we can access it. But the reality is look at it as a digital ally in terms of how you use it, or to your question, how you put survey, sort of recognition insights into action. And to be honest, the problems are the same, but the way that we approach them have to be different, right? Think about it. Like 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it was always think about the employee listening side of it. We ask, then we have the aha, we look at the data, and then we want the action. But it was so hard to bridge that gap. But AI can really speed up that process, which I'll chat about. And even on the recognition side, right? Yeah, we want to recognize key behaviors, but how do you bring that to life? How does AI support, how you create those moments, but also leverage the data on the back end to be able to support leaders, employees, and so on. But I think a couple of ways just more prescriptively that AI closes that gap. First off is it speeds up and automates the understanding. Like just the ability to not have to read 3,000 comments and understand the themes, the sentiment immediately, you can automatically get an idea of what's working, what isn't, and what you could do differently, right? So I think that's really beneficial, and that's not new, but companies I work with that have been leveraging that type of technology over the last 12 months are seeing so much value in turning a 3-4 day process into consolidating understanding to something a little more automated and a little less biased. Like you can say AI is biased, but when HR is reading comments of what their own organization or leaders are, obviously that's a big part of it. I think the second one is just it's basically treating this AI tool as your personal HR analyst. So today, right, like our customers, HR leaders would be able to type in and say, tell me about the trends in recognition. Tell me about the trends in L&D. What are people talking about when it comes to careers? Are things moving the right needle in the sales and marketing team versus a different country? So I call it a coach. So you have this HR analyst in real time that can give you information without having to look through all of the dashboards and things like you had to in the past. And think about it as a consumer, right? You used to go to Google and say, let me look up something. Let me look at 6-7 sites to find out an answer. Now you just type it into ChatGPT and it gives you that information. AI is really supporting that speed to not only understanding, but also this like personal HR analyst in your pocket, so to speak. And I think that the other way that I think AI is providing a big leverage point and insight to action to your question is coaching leaders. So today, technology just allows HR not to have to disseminate data out to a leader in real time for a survey, or AI can nudge leaders to make sure recognition moments should be happening if they're noticing things in the system, or if there's a delay or gap in their time that they're recognizing other folks. But having a coach to be able to say, hey, leader, here's a summary of your information. Here are 6 recommendations of what you could do about it. What do you like? What do you not like? Click a couple of buttons into your action plan so you can actually build accountability on this. These are just like, these aren't pipe dreams. These are happening today when it comes to how AI is being used in technology to make the speed of understanding faster, giving HR data in more real time, but also, like, again, HR can't solve all the world's problems. So putting that into the hands of leaders to say, here's what you can do differently. And it's kind of building this kind of level of just, I'm going to call it a nudge and action system for your whole organization. Maybe the last thing I'll say, Jeff, is just now you have all this data. AI is now looking at correlations on, all right, well, people that get recognized more are seeing higher levels of engagement or higher levels of learning. How do we understand that data? I can get to more on data sides in a bit, but I'll pause there in terms of your question.
I think you just gave a whole seminar right there, in that
Yeah.
answer. No, but no, I think the key thing that kind of stood out for me is what I've been talking about for almost a year now is there are so many different use cases. Like AI is not just one thing. It can do so many different things, and you just mentioned 4 of them right there. And so that the cool thing, like no person, unless you're, Einstein-like or whatever, can actually analyze data, like if you're using it for that use case, at the speed and accuracy that an AI tool can do. And so just imagine not the amount of time that you're saving. It's just massive. It's huge, right? So I think the first hurdle or the first challenge, obviously, is to get the HR community, which, typically are not great at data, are not great at, technology in actually accelerating the use of it. We're still lagging. So getting over those 2 things, I think, is still fundamental and critical. But I think to your point, I think that obviously it's been a game changer. And then obviously WorkTango incorporates all of that into its tool, right? So just talk a bit about that, maybe based on your answer, like what does WorkTango fit into all that?
Yeah, I mean, all the things I was mentioning is what WorkTango does, right? How do you get non-employee listening to be a survey once in a while? It's an always-on listening engine across the web, the employee lifecycle to get that data and serve it to either HR or leaders to create action and impact things like engagement and retention and so on. But again, AI helps. All the things I just mentioned earlier, it does all those things to automate the process, add speed, right? What used to be, I did a quick kind of survey with some HR leaders, and there's about 20 of them. And we asked, before you had a technology, how long did it take to do your survey and then get action? And the average was like 3.5 months, right? Again, a
Yeah,
lot of time. You got
easily.
to serve it to leaders, build action plans. Now you can do it in like 2.5 weeks, right? Everything gets automated in terms of all the analysis, the recommendations, sending it to leaders, and so on. So I think that's where we play. And then on the recognition side, I think very similarly, right? We help companies not only automate your service awards programs and your nominations and awards and all those things you might do and running incentives, but also build that peer-to-peer culture of recognition. But like the one thing I wanted to, I think, mention, which was interesting to your first point, Jeff, was like you talked about, those were like 4 examples of how people are leveraging AI today. One story I thought was really, I think, impactful in terms of understanding the how it can be used today versus the way we did in the past is back at when I was at Achievers, I was working with this giant company that you would recognize the name of, and we had all this data, right? And you think about data of surveys, it's easy. We have all this data, let's analyze it. We had all this recognition data. And what I started doing is with myself, with a data analyst, with Excel, and like some tools that we had back in the day, we tried to get an understanding of, can I have any predictability in retention just based on recognition data? Who recognizes others? Are people getting recognized cross-functionally? Get insights on leaders. Are leaders have any different paths if they are more engaged in recognizing day-to-day moments versus not at all? And long story short, it took this long time period to understand, all right, well, there was a correlation. We're about 80% correct in predicting retention just based on recognition data over a 6-month period. We also started understanding that we were predicting future leaders in the organization because your leaders that recognize others had higher levels of engagement and retention on their teams. And all these data points were in there. And today, you don't, to your point, you don't have to be great at technology. You don't have to be great at data science. I've never been able to build technology. Now I could vibe code things and it works. But today, and back to WorkTango, there's data just to tell you, hey, here's correlation if your leaders are leveraging recognition moments, whether their employees are. Here's archetypes of different leaders, whether they're connectors or executors, or you're understanding more about your leaders based on recognition data. So now I can make better people decisions if I want to build cross-functional teams or decide future leaders in the organization. So it's just this interesting long story, about how AI is now making this more instant. And guess what, HR? You don't have to be a data analyst anymore. You don't have to be a technology wizard. But I think it's fun because now we're still reinventing these spaces, even though we've been in it for 2 decades.
Yeah, I think that perfect segue into my next question. So you talked about listening. So I think a lot of my peers probably don't actually call it that, but that's what it is. You're actually listening to employees. And so my question is, how does smarter listening, right, change the way companies think about recognition? And so what becomes possible that was not possible prior?
Yeah, maybe I mentioned it a little prematurely, but when you have the survey data in terms of what's working, what isn't, right? We all have the questions and the factors like communication and leadership and, wellness and all these items. Well, once you had it, it was really hard to build a bunch of programs to execute and support those. And then it became, again, a program, right? All these individual
Right.
programs on how you're going to fix things in the organization. The way that I'm seeing recognition and rewards and incentives being leveraged is when you have your employee listening details, you get all these major themes in your company. Maybe it is career growth and recognition and so on. And now recognition can now influence these types of activities. When I say influence, you recognize people that are conducting those activities that are driving those 3 strategic narratives from the major survey, for example. You can reward and incentivize people to do more of those activities, right? For example, a big thing is AI adoption now, right? If you're learning people are really struggling with it, you can incentivize and reward people for taking courses, for showing their their idea at company events of how, and we do that at WorkTango, of like we had a little hackathon of how could you use AI in your world. So when you have the information and you want influence action, recognition and reward are some of the most positive and great ways to do it, and statistically validated, like it does influence action in companies. And I mentioned the company level, but even at individual team levels, like if we realize that we have a huge issue in, you know, maybe not your normal employee survey data, but maybe we realize our sales process isn't very good. Incentivize the sales team and marketing team to do the right things, like clean up the pipeline or update Salesforce or whatever it is. So what's interesting is now you're kind of having the ability to use the data and in real time turn on different activities and recognition moments. But the great thing about a platform, this isn't just a one-to-one recognition. All this gets shared with the rest of the organization on news feeds and with leaders, because what gets recognized gets repeated. I think it's a really good connection to the two. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are like I can go into WorkTango today and look at, is there a correlation from people that get recognized more to actually engagement, or people that got recognized more for L&D to the L&D scores to those individuals? And now you're putting money where your mouth is. Like people that get recognized are conducting activities that help the business thrive, whatever you define those things are. So those are just, a few examples and stories, but like how I see that come to fold every day.
So that's really interesting, because that's what we were striving towards always, right? Were to recognize things that mattered to the the actual business, but we couldn't always get there because we didn't really understand what was really going on. So now that so that's all changed, and so that's a good thing.
And by the way, like
Yeah,
I'm
go ahead.
talking about listening just from like employee surveys. Like there are other listening capabilities out there. You might want to,
Sure.
look at threads of emails and Slack messages or Teams messages or other things to find out what are the themes, what are the sentiments, Zoom calls, like
Yeah.
calls with your customers. Like there are ways to get more data. Like the more you feed data, that's where AI can really turn it the right way for you. It's just a matter of, what are you comfortable with in your company in terms of listening, solicited versus unsolicited. And people do both, but just one consideration of how you might want to think about your listening strategy moving forward.
Well, that's a good point. You don't need a physical person actually listening to phone calls. I used to do work with telephone banking operation with the major bank back in the day. And you remember when they had managers like used to sit at the desk and we used to listen to their staff calls. And you remember thinking back then, holy moly, this is like a waste of time, because it's like they're sucking up half their day just listening to calls. And then you got things like bias, and then they get tired and all this kind of stuff. So now we have tools that can do all this for us. So I guess the sort of creepiness of it, I guess, or the whole idea that sort of someone watching over your shoulder, I mean, it's not as prevalent, I don't think, as it once was. So, okay, so most HR leaders have probably figured out their HR strategies going forward. Some are probably still working on it. But if you were to say, talk about what are maybe one or two mindset or capability changes that they should start building now to be ready for the evolution of what we just talked about?
Yeah, so I think specific to employee listening or recognition rewards, people have to get out of that annual to always on mindset, right?
Yeah.
They have to get into that mindset, like doing things once a year, yearly survey, or recognizing people for their 5 years of service. As I said, it doesn't move the needle. It doesn't drive success. I have so many ROI data studies on when you get more frequent, you see impact, whether that's not only on engagement metrics and retention metrics, but business metrics. So, and it sounds overwhelming. Oh my God, I got to do a survey more than once a year as an example. But again, technology bridges that gap, makes it a lot easier. So that's one. And the second is enable your leaders, right? You shouldn't have to hoard data in HR. Data should go to leaders to support their teams, because everyone gets engaged in different ways and every team is different. And or it's enabling them with the right tools and expectations when it comes to building a culture of recognition. So I think those are two good mindsets, but the foundational mindset is like, how do you layer it in and how does AI support those two? And as we talked about, there's many ways that it can. So if an AI layer isn't in the HR strategy that you mentioned, it has to be, because I'm telling you, it's a bit of a hurdle and a bit of a like that flywheel. Like it takes time, but once you start leveraging it, man, can it provide so much impact and value.
Speaking on your behalf of the HR community, because I do still, consider myself part of that community, we are getting there, baby steps, right? So we will get there. This has been a huge thing for almost 2 years now, right? AI in general. I think as a community, while many of us are still in the shit, I haven't done anything phase, which is a big part of us, but I do see a lot of adoption and then a lot of really interesting things going on. So, okay, so just last question. If our viewers can take anything away from what we just talked about, so what would that one thing be?
Yeah. Before I do that, just respond to your comment that it's okay if you haven't started. Like everyone's trying to figure it out. There's been no book on it, but guess what? People are figuring it out. So that's when you just stand on the shoulders of giants and like figure out what other people have done, listen to them, understand, don't repeat their, their errors and
There is
avoid
no
their
shame. No
landmines.
shame whatsoever,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, learn from others. But to your question, in terms of maybe one takeaway is, I'd say, especially because this is about AI, is look at both sides of the AI coin, right? So even beyond recognition rewards or employee listening, people, when I talk to many leaders and they think about AI, they have been, in some cases, band-aided, but the mentality is slash, cost, replace people.
No.
But there has to be an intentional strategy around improving the employee experience. So I think that the takeaway is one, like reframe this AI mindset from efficiency to experience, right? And maybe you're doing it, but like how to use AI to build a better experience. But how you do that is start with the pain points. Don't like sit there and ask yourself, what can AI do? Ask yourself as an HR leader, what's hard right now? What's the friction points in how we build a better employee experience? What sucks right now? And when you find something annoying and frustrating for you and employees, and it takes a long time, that's when you can say, okay, well, now how do I find the right AI solution to fix the problem? Remember, technology is just an enabler, right? You have to start with a problem and technology helps fix that or speed it up or add more efficiency. I think the last thing I'll say, which I think maybe ties in a good way in recognition and rewards and employee listening, is fund the effort, don't fund the result. And what I mean by that is HR leaders give employees permission to experiment, try things. Stop worrying about like, what's the precise ROI of this AI tool that we're going to use or test or leverage? Because no one knows what it is yet, right? So it's how do you promote people to use it? Recognize the journey, even if they fail, right? Recognize effort and experimentation. I mentioned our hackathon, right? These are people that aren't in technology. They don't build AI. They're figuring it out. We've got so many great stories from those starts and stops and successes and failures. And then when you're listening to employees, help them understand what are the gaps to get them to experiment, right? So I think if you reframe the AI idea to what I mentioned is like about experience, not just flashing things, but also on like starting with those pain points, I think that's a really good journey and takeaway if people feel like they're in a rut in terms of making that happen or starting the process.
I think that's a valid point because with the whole pain point thing, because in all the years that I've been working in HR tech, and so I built my own process to help HR leaders figure out their go forward HR tech stack. And it had nothing to do with AI, obviously, back then. But it always started with the business and the strategy and what you are trying to achieve. So that still hasn't changed. The good news, though, is that like AI, the solutions out there are just almost like infinite, right? So, and it's so customizable and flexible. And so there's always, as they used to say, there is an app for that, right? So that's actually quite true here but I have to start with the pain points and the problem, what you're trying to solve. But the good news is that you can feel more confident that there is something out there for it, right? So anyway, I just wanted to point that out.
To that point, right? Like think about WorkTango. Like we don't just build what we think the world will want. We talk to HR leaders and like, what are issues and problems you're having? And they're like, the survey data, we have it, but it might take too long to action, or we can't enable our leaders. Like all those tools that I just talked about are solutions to those, right? So starting with the pain points is what is provided, not just WorkTango, but any vendor out there with technology that can support you. Even an interesting example that I never thought we would build was that some HR leaders, even though recognition is really important, they realize their employees sometimes don't have the words or don't know how to recognize, or there's barriers to recognize folks in other parts of the world. And we've recently just launched this ability to take someone's putting in a recognition into their app or into Slack or into the platform, and it says, do you need some support? And what support could be is type in a few things, let us rewrite it for you, or let's translate that to another language so you can connect with someone. Let me transform that to, if you want to have fun with it, for example, I have friends that are Seinfeld fans and at WorkTango, I can translate it in the voice of Jerry Seinfeld. But like the idea is, how do you use AI to build a better experience so people can actually share recognition moments, which I didn't think was too much of a problem, but starting with the pain points will get you there.
Yeah, I totally agree. So thanks, Rob. We can probably go on for hours, but I'm going to let you go. But thank you for being here. Obviously, you're with WorkTango, which is a Toronto-based company. WorkTango.com, fantastic organization. And so thank you for being here. And so just for all of our viewers, I'm Jeff, and I'm the host of the Unmuted podcast. And so we talk about all things work, HR tech, AI, world of work, leadership, and our episodes live on our website at ScaleHR.com, also on YouTube. Drop your thoughts in our episode, which typically drop every Thursday morning. And we'll, Rob, great to see you. Thanks for doing this.